A billionaire CEO stares at his quiet maid and says the unthinkable. "You'll birth me sons every year with that body." The room falls silent. Her eyes fill with tears. But what happens next shocks everyone. He's a man haunted by loss. She's a shy, innocent maid working just to keep her sick mother alive. But that one sentence sparks a storm neither of them saw coming. A scandal that spreads across headlines. A child who hasn't spoken in years, suddenly whispering words no one thought he could. And a secret that could destroy what little hope they've found. He meant it as a cruel mistake. But fate had other plans. Now the world is watching. She's being called a liar, a homewrecker, a miracle, sometimes all at once, and he's about to risk his empire to protect her name. And his soul. When love rises from the ashes of shame, can forgiveness really heal two broken hearts? Or will the truth tear them apart forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The pre-dawn air held a chill as Mariah Jenkins hurried down the quiet Queen Street toward the subway station. Street lamps cast lonely pools of light on the empty sidewalk as she pulled her worn cardigan closer. Her sensible shoes made soft clicks against the concrete, marking time with her prayers. The same morning ritual she'd followed for the past 3 months since starting at Donovan Enterprises. The subway car rocked gently as it carried her from her modest neighborhood toward Manhattan's gleaming towers. Mariah used the time to review her mental checklist for the day's cleaning duties in the penthouse. She'd learned quickly that Mr. Donovan appreciated thorough attention to detail, though she rarely saw him during her workday. Hours later, as evening settled over the city and rain began to fall, Mariah found herself alone in the penthouse's grand living room. The space always felt heavy with sadness, especially near the beautiful baby grand piano that sat untouched in the corner. Photographs of a striking woman with kind eyes, the late Mrs. Donovan, watched from silver frames on nearby tables. Mariah moved toward the piano, drawn as always to its quiet dignity. Her cleaning cloth glided over the polished surface as she hummed softly. Amazing Grace, her mother's favorite hymn. The gentle melody filled the empty room, bringing a touch of warmth to its careful perfection. She didn't hear the elevator doors open, didn't notice the heavy footsteps approaching until a harsh intake of breath made her spin around. There stood Cade Donovan, his powerful frame filling the doorway. His usually impeccable suit was rumpled, his tie loosened. A faint scent of whiskey clung to him, and his eyes, those steel-grey eyes that commanded boardrooms, were raw with some fresh pain. "Mr. Donovan," Mariah gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "I'm so sorry, I didn't expect. That piano hasn't heard music in 3 years." His voice was rough, barely controlled. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky as rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Mariah's fingers clutched her duster nervously. "I apologize, sir. I shouldn't have." "She used to play." He moved closer, unsteady. "Every evening. Lullabies for our son. Until—" He broke off, his face twisting. The duster slipped from Mariah's trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the marble floor. She bent quickly to retrieve it, her cheeks burning under his intense stare. When she straightened, he had moved closer still. Too close. His breathing was uneven, his eyes darker now as they traveled over her figure in a way that made her want to disappear into the wall. "Sir, I should go," she began, but he cut her off. "With that body," he said, his words slurring slightly, "you could birth me sons every year." The words hung in the air like poison. Mariah felt as if she'd been slapped. Tears sprang to her eyes as shame and humiliation flooded through her. Without a word, she fled past him, her soft shoes silent on the marble floor as she ran for the elevator. Behind her, Cade Donovan stood frozen by the piano, the echo of his cruel words filling the space where her hymn had been moments before. The whiskey haze lifted just enough for him to realize what he'd done, how deeply he'd wounded someone who had shown nothing but kindness in his home. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as shame replaced anger. Through the windows, lightning illuminated the city below, and in that brief, bright moment, he caught his reflection in the glass. A man he barely recognized anymore, a man his late wife would have been ashamed to see. The thunder that followed seemed to mock him as he stood alone in the gathering darkness, haunted by the look of hurt in Mariah's gentle eyes. He reached out and touched the piano where her cleaning cloth still lay, the surface now bearing fingerprints from his unsteady approach. The ghost of her hymn seemed to linger in the air, a reminder of the peace he'd shattered with his thoughtless cruelty. In that moment, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth and power, Cade Donovan had never felt more worthless. The rain continued to fall outside, matching the tears that Mariah would cry on her long subway ride home to Queens. While in his penthouse, Cade Donovan faced the bitter truth of what grief and alcohol had made of him, and the innocent woman who had paid the price for his pain tonight. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Donovan penthouse, painting golden rectangles across the marble floors. Mariah Jenkins stood in the service elevator, her hand hovering over the button for the top floor. Her fingers trembled slightly as she remembered last night's horrible encounter. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning in her tiny Queen's apartment while replaying Mr. Donovan's cruel words over and over. The memory still made her cheeks burn with shame, but her mother's face floated before her eyes, worn and tired, but still smiling despite the pain that kept her confined to bed most days. The medication costs were crushing, and this job paid better than any other cleaning position she'd found. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, then pressed the button. The elevator doors opened to reveal Mrs. Porter, the head housekeeper, arranging fresh flowers in the foyer. The older woman's sharp eyes took in Mariah's pale face. "There you are, dear. Mr. Donovan's waiting in his study. Wants to see you straight away." Mrs. Porter's tone was carefully neutral, but concern flickered in her eyes. Mariah's heart jumped into her throat. "He's here? But he's usually gone by now. Been here since dawn, pacing like a caged lion." Mrs. Porter lowered her voice. "Whatever happened last night, and don't think we haven't noticed something did, just hear him out." The walk to the study felt endless. Mariah's soft-soled shoes made no sound on the polished floor, but her heartbeat seemed loud enough to echo off the walls. She knocked quietly on the heavy wooden door. "Come in." His voice was clear and steady, nothing like last night's whiskey-rough tone. Cade Donovan stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense under his perfectly tailored suit. When he turned to face her, Mariah was struck by the dark circles under his eyes. He looked as if he hadn't slept either. "Miss Jenkins." He cleared his throat. "Please, sit down." She perched on the edge of a leather armchair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them. "What I said last night was unforgivable." His words came out stiff, unpracticed. "I was drunk and angry about business matters, but that's no excuse. I've never—" He ran a hand through his dark hair. "I don't make a habit of speaking to women that way. To anyone that way." Mariah kept her eyes on her clasped hands. "I understand if you want my resignation, sir." "No." The force of his response made her look up. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to gentle his tone. "No, Miss Jenkins. I'm asking you to stay. In fact, I'll double your current salary if you do." Her eyes widened. Double? That would mean her mother could start the new treatment her doctor had recommended. "Why?" she asked softly. Something like pain flickered across his face. "Because you're excellent at your job, Because my behavior was inexcusable and I'm trying to make it right. Because—" He hesitated. "Because this place feels less empty when you're here." She studied him carefully. The man before her seemed worlds away from the cruel, drunken figure of last night. But still, "If I stay," she said slowly, "I need your word that you'll keep your distance, Mr. Donovan. No more late-night encounters. No more inappropriate comments. You have my word." He held her gaze steadily. "And I'll put it in writing if you wish." Mariah thought of her mother, of the mounting medical bills. "That won't be necessary. I'll stay." Relief washed over his features, quickly masked by his usual businesslike expression. "Thank you, Miss Jenkins. Mrs. Porter will adjust your salary immediately." She rose to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "The hymn you were singing." He swallowed hard. "My wife used to play it sometimes." Mariah nodded once, then slipped out of the study. Throughout the day she felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. Anna, one of the younger maids, practically ran from the room when Mariah entered. In the kitchen she overheard Luis, the chef, defending her to a group of staff members. "Miss Jenkins is a good girl," he insisted. "Not like that last one who tried to trap Mr. Donovan with pregnancy claims." "Still," someone muttered, "you saw how he looked at her." Mariah focused on her work, trying to ignore the gossip that seemed to follow her from room to room. By evening, most of the staff had gone home, leaving her to finish the upstairs rooms in blessed quiet. She was wiping down the kitchen counters, humming softly to herself, when the weight of the day suddenly overwhelmed her. Sinking into a chair, she bowed her head. "Lord," she prayed quietly, unaware that Cade had paused in the hallway outside. "Please help me find the strength to forgive Mr. Donovan. I know he's hurting. I see it in his eyes every day. He's so lost in his grief that he's forgotten how to be kind, even to himself. Help me show him the compassion you've shown me, even when it's hard." Outside the kitchen, Cade stood frozen, her words hitting him like physical blows. Compassion? After what he'd said to her? He'd expected anger, resentment, maybe even a lawsuit, but not this simple, sincere prayer for his soul. Later that night, in his vast bedroom, Cade walked past the crystal decanter of whiskey that usually helped him find sleep. Instead, he found himself kneeling beside his bed, something he hadn't done since Sarah died. "I don't know if you're listening," he whispered roughly into the darkness. "I don't know if you listen to broken men who've turned their backs on you. But if you do," his voice cracked, "if you do, please help me be worthy of the forgiveness she offered so freely. Help me find my way back to the man Sarah loved, the man who knew how to be gentle. Help me." The words trailed off into silence as tears, the first he'd shed in 3 years, slid down his cheeks. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars, while somewhere in Queens, Mariah Jenkins smiled in her sleep, dreaming of her mother's face when she told her about the raise. The days following their agreement settled into a careful rhythm. Mariah moved through the penthouse like a gentle breeze, her presence felt but never intrusive. She dusted the crystal vases, straightened the throw pillows, and polished the hardwood floors until they gleamed like honey in the morning light. All the while, she could feel the weight of curious eyes following her every move. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown more persistent as Cade Donovan began spending more time working from his home office. The other staff members exchanged meaningful glances whenever he appeared in a room where Mariah was cleaning, though he never approached her directly, true to his word. But Mariah noticed something else, something that made the gossip easier to bear. It was the way Cade watched his son, Evan, whenever the boy wandered into spaces where Mariah worked. The 7-year-old had caught her attention from her first day. Those solemn brown eyes in such a young face, the way he communicated only through nods or shakes of his head. The staff had told her in hushed tones about how he hadn't spoken a single word since his mother's death 2 years ago. On this particular afternoon, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the music room, catching dust motes in golden beams. Mariah moved carefully around Sarah Donovan's piano, a magnificent Steinway that dominated the space. Her cleaning cloth glided over the polished ebony surface as she hummed softly, then gradually let the words flow. "When peace like a river attendeth my way," she sang quietly, "when sorrows like sea billows roll." The hymn always brought her peace, reminded her of Sunday mornings in her mother's tiny kitchen, of hope that persisted even in hard times. A slight movement behind the heavy velvet curtains caught her eye, but she pretended not to notice. She'd seen Evan hide there before, watching her work. Instead, she continued singing, her voice carrying the familiar melody with gentle assurance. "Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Mommy says you're my angel." The words were so soft, so unexpected, that Mariah's cleaning cloth slipped from her fingers. She turned slowly, heart thundering in her chest, to find Evan peering out from behind the curtain. His small face held such earnestness that tears pricked at her eyes. "What did you say, sweetheart?" she whispered, afraid speaking too loudly might break this magical moment. "Mommy comes in my dreams," Evan said, his voice rusty from disuse. "She told me you're the angel she sent to help us not be sad anymore." In the hallway, unseen by either of them, Cade Donovan gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. He'd been passing by when he'd heard Mariah's singing, had paused to listen as he often did these days. But now, hearing his son's voice for the first time in 2 years, he felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath his feet. Tears burned behind his eyes as he watched his son step out from behind the curtain, moving toward Mariah with tentative steps. Mariah knelt down, opening her arms without thinking. Evan walked into them naturally, as if he'd done it 100 times before. "Your mommy sounds very wise," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "She is." Evan nodded against her shoulder. "She says Daddy's sad because he misses her too much, but we don't have to be sad forever." A choked sound from the doorway made them both look up. Cade stood there, one hand pressed against his mouth, tears streaming unchecked down his face. Evan pulled back from Mariah's embrace, looking uncertain for a moment, then walked to his father. "Hi, Daddy," he said simply. Cade dropped to his knees, gathering his son in his arms with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside him. "Hi, buddy," he managed. "I've missed your voice so much." Mariah quietly picked up her cleaning supplies, trying to give them privacy, but Cade's voice stopped her. "Please," he said hoarsely. "Stay." That evening, after Evan had been tucked into bed, having chatted quietly about his favorite books and the drawings he'd been making, Cade found Mariah in the kitchen. She was preparing to leave for the day, her bag already slung over her shoulder. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice still rough with emotion. Mariah shook her head, adjusting her bag strap. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Donovan. Maybe he just needed to hear hope again. Sometimes we all do." Cade studied her face in the soft kitchen light, seeing the same gentle wisdom that had somehow reached through his son's silence. "You've brought hope back into this house," he said quietly. "I'd forgotten what that felt like." The next morning, when Mariah arrived at work, Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper, informed her that her salary had been raised again. "Mr. Donovan's orders," the older woman said with a knowing smile. "And he'd like you to join him and Master Evan for breakfast from now on." And so another change entered their careful routine. Each morning, Maria would sit at the kitchen table with Evan and Cade, sharing coffee and conversations that grew less awkward with each passing day. Evan would tell them about his dreams, about the mother who visited him there with messages of love and comfort. Sometimes, when the morning light caught Cade's face just right, Maria could see shadows of the man he must have been before grief hardened him. The father who laughed at his son's jokes, the husband who had loved so deeply that losing that love had nearly destroyed him. They were small steps, these shared breakfasts and quiet conversations, but Maria recognized them for what they were, the first tender shoots of healing breaking through frozen ground, reaching towards the light. And if sometimes she caught Cade watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, she told herself it was just gratitude. Nothing more. After all, she was just the maid who sang hymns while she cleaned, just the woman who happened to be there when hope found its way back into the Donovan home. The warm autumn days mellowed into early December, bringing with them a gentle transformation within the Donovan penthouse. Where silence had once ruled, Evan's voice now filled the rooms with questions, stories, and even the occasional burst of laughter. Each morning, Maria would find him waiting by the piano, clutching his sketchbook and colored pencils. "Can we draw Mommy today?" he'd ask, his eyes bright with purpose. Maria would settle beside him, her cleaning duties momentarily forgotten as she helped him capture his memories on paper. "Tell me about this picture," she'd say, watching as his small hands moved across the page with determination. Today he was drawing a woman with long brown hair pushing a swing. "This was at the park," Evan explained, carefully coloring the sky blue. "Mommy loved the swings. She said they made her feel like she could touch the clouds." He paused, adding little birds in the background. "Do you think she can touch them for real now?" Maria's heart squeezed. "I bet she can, sweetheart. And I bet she's watching you draw right now, so proud of how well you're doing." From his office doorway, Cade observed these interactions, feeling something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest. The mansion was changing. The heavy drapes that had been drawn for so long now stayed open, letting sunlight stream across the hardwood floors. The piano, once a shrine to grief, rang with simple melodies as Maria taught Evan basic scales. Even the staff noticed the difference. Mrs. Porter commented on how Master Donovan was drinking less, working reasonable hours, and actually joining them for meals. Luis, the chef, remarked that the kitchen hadn't seen so much use since before the tragedy. Where takeout containers had once dominated, now there were family dinners with Evan chattering about his day. One evening, as Cade worked late in his study, he heard Maria reading to Evan in the library. Her voice carried down the hall, bringing the story to life with different character voices that made his son giggle. He found himself setting aside his papers, drawn to the sound like a moth to flame. "But I can't do it," said the little engine. Maria read dramatically. "I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you can," Evan called out, completely caught up in the tale. Cade leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Maria sat in the old leather armchair, Evan curled against her side, both so absorbed in the story they didn't notice him. The scene struck him with such longing it nearly took his breath away. This was what his home had been missing, not just noise, but life. When the charity dinner for the Children's Hope Orphanage came up on his calendar, Cade surprised everyone by asking Maria to help coordinate it. She had mentioned her volunteer work there, and her experience with children would be invaluable for the auction portion of the evening. The night of the event transformed the hotel ballroom into a winter wonderland. Maria moved efficiently between tables, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the designer gowns around her. She helped arrange the children's artwork for auction, each piece carefully displayed with the artist's story. Cade found himself watching her more than the proceedings. She had a way of making everyone feel at ease, from the nervous children presenting their art to the wealthy donors writing checks. Even his board members, initially skeptical of having the Maid involved, were won over by her genuine passion for the cause. "And now," Mariah announced, her voice clear and confident, "I'd like to introduce you to Sophie, one of our talented young artists." She guided a small girl with braids to the microphone, keeping a gentle hand on her shoulder as the child explained how art therapy had helped her after losing her parents. The audience was captivated. Donations poured in. By the end of the night, they had raised more than double their goal. Cade couldn't help but smile as Mariah hugged each child goodbye, promising to visit them soon at the orphanage. "You were amazing tonight," he told her as they gathered their coats. Without thinking, he placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. "I've never seen the board so impressed." "The children did all the work." She demurred, but her cheeks flushed at the praise. "I just helped them share their stories." Neither of them noticed the photographer lurking behind a potted plant, or the rapid click of his camera capturing their intimate moment. The next morning exploded with headlines. Mariah's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as tabloid after tabloid ran the story. CEO Donovan sleeping with his maid. The photos showed them leaving the hotel together, his hand on her back, both smiling. The articles were cruel, painting her as a gold digger and him as a man taking advantage of his household staff. When Mariah arrived at work, the other employees wouldn't meet her eyes. Anna, who had once been friendly, now whispered behind her hand to the security guard. Even Mrs. Porter's usual warm greeting was replaced with a cool nod. "Did you see what they're saying?" Louise asked quietly when she entered the kitchen. "There are reporters camped outside the building. They're calling you his... He couldn't finish the sentence. Mariah's hands shook as she prepared Evan's breakfast. She could hear the whispers, feel the stares. When she brought the food to the dining room, Evan ran to hug her as usual, but Mrs. Porter quickly pulled him away. "Perhaps it's best if you stick to your cleaning duties today," the housekeeper said stiffly. "I'll serve breakfast." Cade arrived home early that afternoon, his face grim. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, where his entire board of directors waited in the living room. Mariah was dusting the bookshelves, trying to make herself invisible. "This is unacceptable, Cade," Richard Morton, the head of the board, declared. "The company's stock has already taken a hit. We need to contain this scandal immediately." "By doing what exactly?" Cade's voice was dangerously quiet. "She has to go," another board member stated flatly. "Fire her today. Issue a statement denying any impropriety, and this will blow over." Mariah's duster froze mid-motion. She could feel Cade's eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. The shame and humiliation of the past 24 hours pressed down on her like a physical weight. "You're asking me to fire someone who's done nothing wrong," Cade said slowly. "Someone who's helped my son find his voice again, who's brought life back to this house, who's done more good for our company's image in one charity dinner than all our PR firms combined. We're asking you to protect this company's reputation," Morton countered. "Unless, of course, there's truth to these rumors." The silence that followed was deafening. Mariah finally turned, meeting Cade's conflicted gaze across the room. She saw the struggle there, the war between his heart and his obligations. Before he could speak, she set down her cleaning supplies. "Mr. Donovan," she said quietly, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I think it's best if I tender my resignation, effective immediately." The board members nodded in satisfaction, but Cade took a step toward her. "Mariah, wait. Please." She cut him off, unable to bear his kindness. "It's better this way, for everyone." She gathered her things quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. As she waited for the elevator, she could hear the board already discussing damage control strategies. Just before the doors closed, she heard the patter of small feet and Evan's voice calling, "Mariah, don't go!" But she kept her eyes forward, letting the tears fall only when she was alone in the descending elevator, leaving behind the family that had somehow become her own. Morning sunlight glinted off the sea of cameras and microphones crowding the Donovan Enterprises lobby. Security guards formed a tight barrier between the press and the makeshift podium where Cade Donovan would soon appear. The air buzzed with anticipation as reporters jostled for position, their equipment ready to capture whatever statement the billionaire CEO planned to make about his alleged affair with the maid. Upstairs in the penthouse kitchen, Mariah's hands trembled as she switched on the small television mounted under the cabinet. She hadn't slept all night, torn between leaving immediately and staying for Evan's sake. The boy had cried himself to sleep, begging her not to go. The TV screen flickered to life just as Cade strode onto the platform. His presence commanded immediate attention, tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. But there was something different about him today. The usual cold mask had slipped, revealing a fierce determination in his eyes. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "I've called this press conference to address the recent allegations regarding my employee, Miss Mariah Jenkins." In the kitchen, Mariah's heart stuttered at the sound of her name. Mrs. Porter and two other maids quietly entered, their eyes darting between her and the television screen. "The tabloids have painted a salacious picture of impropriety between myself and Miss Jenkins." Cade continued, his jaw tightening. "These accusations are not only false but represent the worst kind of character assassination. Miss Jenkins is an exemplary employee whose primary focus has been caring for my son, Evan." The cameras flashed frantically as he paused, his hands gripping the podium's edges. "Many of you know that my son hasn't spoken since his mother's death 2 years ago. What you don't know is that thanks to Miss Jenkins' gentle presence and care, he has finally found his voice again." Cade's own voice softened slightly. "She has brought healing to my home, not scandal, and I will not stand by while her reputation is dragged through the mud for the sake of tabloid sales." Tears welled in Mariah's eyes as she watched. Mrs. Porter reached over and squeezed her hand, her earlier coldness forgotten. "Therefore," Cade's voice grew steely, "I am making it absolutely clear. Miss Jenkins is under my protection. Any media outlet that continues to publish false allegations about her will face immediate legal action. Furthermore, any employee of Donovan Enterprises found spreading these malicious rumors will be terminated without warning." The reporters erupted with questions, but Cade raised his hand for silence. "Miss Jenkins represents the values this company was built on: integrity, compassion, and dedication to others. She will remain in her position as long as she chooses, with my full support and gratitude. That's all." He strode off the platform, ignoring the shouted questions and camera flashes. Mariah stared at the empty podium, her tears falling freely now. No one had ever defended her like that before. An hour later, she was in her quarters, folding her uniforms into a small suitcase. Despite Cade's powerful words, she couldn't bear the thought of causing more trouble for him or Evan. The media would eventually lose interest if she just disappeared. She was so focused on packing that she didn't hear the elevator arrive. The sound of footsteps made her turn to find Cade in the doorway, his tie loosened and hair slightly disheveled from running his fingers through it. "Going somewhere?" he asked quietly. "Mr. Donovan, She struggled to find the right words. "What you did was incredibly kind, but we both know this won't blow over as long as I'm here. My company will survive." He cut in. "Evan might not." The words hung heavy between them. Mariah's hands clutched a folded uniform, her knuckles white, He needs you. Cade continued, taking a step closer. These past few months, you've given him something I couldn't. Hope. A reason to speak again. He ran a hand through his hair again, a gesture she'd come to recognize as uncertainty. Stay. At least until he's stronger. Mariah looked down at the half-packed suitcase, torn between her desire to protect them from scandal and her love for the little boy who'd stolen her heart. Temporarily, she finally whispered. Just until Evan's doing better. Relief flooded Cade's features. Thank you. He glanced at his watch. It's been a long day. Would you join me for tea? In the kitchen? The request surprised her. Staff never shared meals with employers in their private spaces. But something had shifted between them today, the rigid lines of hierarchy blurred by his public defense of her honor. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, steam rising from 2 mugs of chamomile tea. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but filled with unspoken understanding. I never thanked you, Cade said suddenly, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. For what? For bringing music back into this house, for making Evan laugh again. He met her eyes. For showing me that sometimes the strongest thing a person can be is gentle. Mariah felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. I just did what felt right. They talked quietly as evening settled over the city, sharing stories about Evan's progress and their hopes for his future. For the first time, they spoke as equals, not employer and employee, but 2 people who cared deeply about the same child. Later that night, after Mariah had gone to her room, Cade stood at his office window. The city stretched out before him, a tapestry of twinkling lights and endless possibilities. He realized with sudden clarity that the numbness that had encased his heart since losing his wife was gone. In its place was something new, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The first snowflakes of December drifted past the penthouse windows as Mariah measured flour into a mixing bowl. The kitchen, once sterile and unused, now filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and vanilla. At the counter, Evan sat perched on a stool, his small hands covered in sticky batter as he helped make pancakes. A little more milk, Mariah guided gently, steadying his hand as he poured. Perfect. The elevator chimed, and Cade stepped into the kitchen, already dressed in his suit but without his usual briefcase. For the past week, he'd been arriving later to the office, choosing instead to share these quiet morning moments with them. Something smells wonderful, he said, loosening his tie. Evan's face lit up. Daddy, we're making breakfast. The joy in those simple words still caught Cade off guard. After 2 years of silence, his son's voice felt like a miracle every time he heard it. He watched as Mariah helped Evan flip a pancake, her patience never wavering when some batter splattered onto the counter. Would you like to try, Mr. Donovan? Mariah asked, holding out the spatula. I haven't cooked anything since college. He admitted, but took it anyway. Under her guidance, he managed to create a slightly lopsided but golden brown pancake that made Evan giggle. They sat together at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows. Cade noticed how Mariah cut Evan's pancakes into small, neat squares, just the way his son liked them. She remembered these little details about people, their preferences, their comfort, and tended to them with natural grace. Throughout the week, Cade found himself looking for reasons to be home more often. He delegated meetings, rearranged his schedule, and started leaving the office earlier. The board members raised their eyebrows, but he didn't care. Something was changing in the mansion's atmosphere, and he didn't want to miss it. In the evenings, they gathered in Evan's room for bedtime stories. Mariah's voice brought characters to life, while Evan snuggled between them, pointing at pictures and asking questions. Cade discovered he loved these moments most, when his son's imagination sparked and the weight of his own grief lifted slightly. One afternoon, Mariah suggested they decorate for Christmas. The mansion could use some warmth, she said carefully, knowing the holiday had been ignored since his wife's passing. To her surprise, Cade agreed. They spent hours unpacking dusty boxes from storage, Evan excitedly pulling out ornaments while Mariah untangled strings of lights. When they found a hand-painted ornament with "Baby's First Christmas" written in his late wife's elegant script, Cade grew quiet. Mariah touched his arm gently. "We can put these special ones in Evan's room, if you'd prefer." He shook his head. "No, they belong on the tree. Sarah would have wanted that." It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud in years. Mariah pretended not to notice the tremor in his voice, instead helping Evan hang the precious ornament on a prominent branch. By evening, the mansion glowed with soft white lights. Garland draped the staircase, and the massive tree in the living room sparkled with a mix of elegant glass balls and child-made decorations. Cade watched Mariah lift Evan to place the star on top, her face glowing with joy at his excitement. That night, after Evan was asleep, Cade found Mariah arranging presents under the tree. She jumped slightly when he approached. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. I was just making everything perfect." He finished, smiling. "You always do." Their eyes met in the dim light, and something shifted in the air between them. Cade felt drawn to the gentleness in her face, the way her eyes held both strength and vulnerability. He wanted to tell her how she'd transformed their lives, how her presence made him believe in second chances. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you." Later, in her small quarters, Mariah knelt beside her bed. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "give me wisdom. Help me remember my place here. Don't let me mistake kindness for something more." But even as she prayed, she couldn't forget the warmth in Cade's eyes or how natural it felt to be part of their family. On Christmas Eve, snow fell steadily as their car pulled up to the small stone church. Evan bounced excitedly in his seat, wearing the new sweater Mariah had helped him pick out. Inside, candles flickered in every window, and the air smelled of pine and frankincense. They found seats near the middle, Evan immediately reaching for Mariah's hand. The familiar carols washed over them as the congregation sang. During a quiet moment, Mariah glanced at Cade and saw him with his head bowed, eyes closed tight. His lips moved silently in what could only be prayer. "Forgive me," he mouthed, his expression raw with emotion. "Help me be worthy of this second chance." The service ended with "Silent Night," the sanctuary lit only by candlelight. As they stood together, Evan between them, Cade felt a peace he hadn't known in years. That night, exhausted but content, he drifted off to sleep in his chair by the fire. In his dreams, Sarah came to him. She wore the white dress from their wedding day, her smile as bright as he remembered. "You've been so lost," she said softly, touching his cheek. "But look what love has brought back into our home." "I miss you," he whispered. "I know. But don't let guilt keep you from joy, my love. This is your second chance. Don't waste it." He woke with tears on his cheeks, the dream still vivid in his mind. From somewhere in the mansion, he heard Evan's laughter mixing with Mariah's voice as they prepared for bed. The sound filled his heart with both gratitude and possibility. The week after Christmas brought a gentle shift to the Donovan mansion. Holiday decorations still sparkled throughout the rooms, but there was something more, a warmth that went beyond twinkling lights and garland. It lived in the sound of Evan's laughter echoing down hallways that had been silent for too long, in the quiet conversations over morning coffee, and in the way Cade's shoulders seemed less burdened with each passing day. One crisp morning, Cade found Mariah in the kitchen, helping Evan with his breakfast. "I'd like to discuss something with you," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness she'd never heard before. "When you have a moment?" Later that morning, in his home office, Cade spread several documents across his desk. "I've been thinking about starting a new charitable foundation," he explained, watching Mariah's face carefully. "Something to help single mothers who are struggling. Would you consider helping me organize it?" Mariah's eyes widened. "Me? But I don't have any experience with—" "You have exactly the experience I need." Cade interrupted gently. "You understand their struggles firsthand, having helped your own mother, and I've seen how you run the household, how you organize everything so efficiently. Plus," he added with a small smile, "you have more compassion in your little finger than most of my board members combined." Touched by his faith in her, Mariah agreed. They began meeting regularly in his office, reviewing proposals and discussing ideas. Cade found himself looking forward to these sessions, where their conversations would often drift beyond business into deeper waters. "My father left when I was 8, Mariah shared one afternoon, sorting through applications. "Mum worked 3 jobs sometimes, just to keep food on the table, but she never lost her faith. Every night, no matter how tired she was, she'd pray with me." Cade watched her hands move purposefully through the papers. "That must have been hard." "It was, but it taught me something valuable. That strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up, believing tomorrow might be better." Her words struck a chord in Cade's heart. He thought about how he'd handled his own grief, not by getting back up, but by building walls so high he couldn't even see tomorrow anymore. One evening, as they worked late reviewing documents, thunder rumbled outside. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the office into darkness. Mariah let out a small gasp of surprise. "Stay put," Cade said, his voice steady in the darkness. "I know where some candles are." He returned moments later with several thick pillar candles, setting them carefully around the room. Their warm light cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that made both of them slightly nervous. "Maybe we should call it a night," Mariah suggested softly. "Just a few more applications," Cade replied, though his focus had little to do with the papers before him. In the candlelight, he couldn't help noticing how the soft glow transformed Mariah's face, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek, the warmth in her eyes. They worked in silence for a while, until Mariah noticed Cade staring at a photo on his desk, his wedding photo, barely visible in the dim light. "Do you want to talk about her?" she asked quietly. Cade was silent for so long, Mariah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice rough with emotion, he spoke. "I haven't prayed since Sarah died. Not really. I'd get down on my knees sometimes, but all I felt was anger. How could a loving God take her away? Take Evan's mother?" He ran a hand through his hair. "I used to believe so strongly. Now, I don't know how to find my way back." Mariah's heart ached for him. "Sometimes the darkest rooms show us the smallest lights," she said softly. "Maybe faith isn't about having all the answers. Maybe it's about trusting there's still light, even when we can't see it." Their eyes met across the desk, and suddenly the air felt charged with something more than just conversation. Cade found himself leaning forward, drawn by the compassion in her eyes, the gentle wisdom of her words. Mariah remained still, her heart thundering in her chest as he moved closer. For one breathless moment, their faces were inches apart. Cade could smell the light floral scent of her perfume, could see the flutter of her eyelashes in the candlelight. But just before their lips met, reality crashed over him like a cold wave. He jerked back, shame flooding his features. "I'm sorry," he said roughly, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. I shouldn't have. It's okay, Mariah whispered, though her trembling hands betrayed her composure. We should probably call it a night. She gathered her things quickly, trying to ignore how her fingers shook. At the door, she paused. Good night, Mr. Donovan. The formal use of his name felt like a wall being rebuilt between them, and Cade wanted to stop her, to explain, to say something, anything, to make this right. But he remained silent, watching her disappear into the darkened hallway. The next morning, they both acted as if nothing had happened. Mariah served breakfast with her usual quiet efficiency, and Cade buried himself in his newspaper. But there was a new tension in the air, an awareness that couldn't be ignored. Their easy companionship had been replaced by something more complicated, more dangerous. As Mariah went about her duties, she caught herself touching her lips, remembering how close they'd come to crossing a line she'd promised herself she'd never cross. And in his office, Cade stared at the candles still sitting on his desk, wondering how something as simple as candlelight could have almost changed everything. The late afternoon sun streamed through the penthouse windows as Mariah helped 7-year-old Evan with his bow tie. The tiny black tuxedo made him look like a miniature version of his father, right down to the carefully combed hair and polished shoes. Hold still, sweetheart, Mariah said softly, adjusting the fabric. There we go, perfect. Evan beamed at her, his eyes bright with excitement. Do I look like Daddy? Every bit as handsome, she assured him, smoothing down his lapels. Unknown to them, Cade stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. His chest tightened at the natural way Mariah cared for his son, how Evan responded to her gentle touch and patient words. In just a few months, she'd become more than just their maid. She'd become the heart of their home. You both look wonderful, Cade said, stepping into the room. Mariah looked up, startled. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress, borrowed from the wardrobe department for the evening's charity gala. Her hair was swept up in a classic updo, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. Thank you, Mr. Donovan, she replied formally, though her cheeks flushed slightly. They'd been careful to maintain professional boundaries since that night in the candlelight, but moments like these made it difficult. Daddy, look. Evan twirled around, showing off his outfit. Mariah taught me how to tie my shoes all by myself. Cade's expression softened. That's wonderful, son. He glanced at Mariah, gratitude evident in his eyes. Every small victory in Evan's development felt like a miracle, and she'd been behind so many of them. The drive to the venue was filled with Evan's excited chatter, more words than he'd spoken in the past 2 years combined. Mariah sat in the back with him, helping him practice his part in the evening's presentation. He was supposed to hand out thank you cards to the major donors, a small but significant role for the formerly silent child. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant decorations. Photographers lined the entrance, their cameras flashing as New York's elite arrived. When Cade stepped out of the car with Evan and Mariah, the reporters surged forward, remembering the scandal from months ago. Mr. Donovan, is it true your maid has been promoted to nanny? Ms. Jenkins, how does it feel to be part of the Donovan household? Cade placed a protective hand on Evan's shoulder, while Mariah kept her head high, ignoring the questions with quiet dignity. Inside, the ballroom was already filling with socialites in designer gowns and business tycoons in expensive suits. Many eyes followed them as they made their way through the crowd. Remember, Mariah whispered to Evan, kneeling to his level. You're going to do great, just like we practiced. The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his stack of thank you cards. Cade watched their interaction, struck by how natural they looked together. Maria had an innate ability to calm his son's nerves, to make him feel safe and confident. The evening progressed smoothly. Cade delivered his opening speech about the importance of supporting single mothers and children in need. The cause was personal now, inspired by Mariah's own story of growing up with a hard-working single mother. As he spoke, he could see her in the audience, smiling encouragingly at Evan. Then came time for the thank you ceremony. Evan was supposed to wait until each donor's name was called, then walk up and hand them their card. But something unexpected happened. As the first name was about to be announced, Evan suddenly broke away from his handler. He ran straight to the stage, grabbing the microphone from its stand. His clear voice rang through the ballroom. "Mama, I did it!" The room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes turned to Mariah, who stood frozen in place, her hand covering her mouth. Cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the moment. On stage, Cade's expression was a mixture of shock, awe, and raw emotion. Evan continued, his words tumbling out excitedly. "I learned all my cards, just like you helped me practice. I'm not scared anymore." Tears streamed down Mariah's face as she nodded encouragingly at him. The audience, moving past their initial surprise, broke into warm applause. Several people were wiping their eyes, touched by the pure emotion of the moment. Cade stepped forward and lifted his son into his arms, his own eyes glistening. The photographers went wild, capturing image after image of the tender scene. In that moment, the cold, calculating CEO was simply a father, his face full of love and gratitude. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Social media exploded with videos of the moment. Donovan's angel trending within hours. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines like "The Maid Who Healed a Billionaire's Son" and "A Modern Mary Poppins, the Miracle at Donovan Enterprises." Messages began pouring in from around the world. Parents of children with selective mutism shared their own stories, calling Mariah an inspiration. Religious groups praised her faith and gentle spirit. Even cynical tabloids couldn't find fault with the genuine emotion captured in the photos. Later that night, after Evan had fallen asleep still wearing his bow tie, Cade found Mariah in the kitchen. She was reading messages on her phone, looking overwhelmed by the attention. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I never meant for this to happen. All those cameras, the headlines. Don't apologize." Cade interrupted softly. "What you've done for Evan, I can never repay you." He watched her in the dim kitchen light, his heart full of emotions he couldn't express. She'd brought light back into their lives, helped his son find his voice, and somehow managed to retain her humility through it all. The urge to pull her close, to confess how deeply she'd affected him, was almost overwhelming. But he held back, remembering the media circus outside. She deserved better than to be dragged further into his complicated world, to have her reputation questioned by gossip columnists and board members. His feelings, growing stronger each day, would have to remain unspoken. "You should get some rest," he said instead. "It's been a long night." Mariah nodded, gathering her things. At the kitchen door, she paused. "Mr. Donovan?" "Yes. Thank you for letting me be part of this, part of their lives." Her voice was soft, full of genuine gratitude. Cade watched her leave, his heart heavy with unspoken words. In the silence of the kitchen, he realized he was falling in love with her, not just for what she'd done for Evan, but for who she was. Kind, strong, and unafraid to show genuine emotion in a world that often scorned it. But love, he reminded himself, sometimes meant protecting someone from the complications of your own life. So he stayed in the kitchen, letting her go, even as his heart urged him to follow. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the penthouse windows, but the warmth couldn't reach the chill that had settled in the living room. Lydia Marlowe stood like a statue of perfection, her designer dress hugging curves that hadn't changed since she'd left Cade's life years ago. Her presence was like a storm cloud, darkening the peaceful sanctuary the home had become. "Darling, we need to talk." Lydia's voice dripped honey and venom. She'd breezed past security with the confidence of someone who once belonged here. Privately. Cade's jaw tightened as he glanced toward the kitchen where Mariah was helping Evan with breakfast. "My office," he said curtly, leading the way. The moment the heavy door closed behind them, Lydia's perfectly painted smile faltered. "I'm pregnant, Cade, and before you say anything, yes, it's yours." The words hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. "That's impossible. Remember that night? 6 years ago, right before—" She paused dramatically. "Before Sarah died. The charity ball at the plaza. You were upset about your fight with her and I was there to comfort you." Kad's mind raced back to that night. The memories were hazy with whiskey and grief, but he remembered arguing with Sarah about working too much, about missing doctor's appointments. He'd stormed out, ended up at the ball, and Lydia had been there, but nothing had happened. Had it? "You're lying," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Am I?" Lydia's hand rested on her stomach. "I've kept this secret for weeks now, trying to find the right time. But seeing you with that, Maid, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. You need to do the right thing, Cade." Unknown to either of them, Mariah stood frozen in the hallway, a stack of fresh towels in her arms. She'd come to deliver them to the master bathroom, but Lydia's words pierced through the door like arrows. "If there was anything between us that night, why wait 6 years to tell me?" Cade's voice was strained. "Because I knew you weren't ready then. After Sarah, you were broken. But now, with this common girl playing house with my man, I won't stand for it." Mariah's hands trembled. The towels fell silently to the carpet as she backed away, her heart crumbling inside her chest. "She's not common." Cade's defense was immediate, but weak against the weight of Lydia's accusation. "And there's nothing between us." "No." Lydia laughed softly. "Then why does your son call her Mama? Why do the papers call her your angel? Face it, Cade, you're letting this nobody steal what should be mine. Our child deserves better." Guilt and confusion warred on Cade's face. That night 6 years ago was a blur of pain and alcohol. Could he have? The possibility alone was enough to silence him. Through the rest of the day, tension hung heavy in the penthouse. Mariah moved through her duties like a ghost, avoiding Cade's eyes. When Evan asked her to read his bedtime story, her voice cracked on words about happy endings. After tucking him in, she returned to her room and pulled out her suitcase. Tears fell silently as she folded each piece of clothing, remembering moments attached to them. The sweater she'd worn when Evan first spoke, the dress from the charity gala. A knock at her door made her quickly wipe her eyes. "Come in," she called, trying to steady her voice. Cade entered, looking tired and troubled. His eyes fell on the open suitcase. "You're packing?" "Just for a few days," she lied, forcing a smile. "My mother. She needs me for a bit." "Mariah." He stepped closer, then stopped, as if invisible walls had sprung up between them. "About today. About Lydia. It's not my place to judge." She interrupted softly. "Family matters are private." "You are family," he said, but the words hung hollow in the air, shadowed by Lydia's claims. "No." Mariah shook her head, closing her suitcase with finality. "I'm the help. I always have been. I just forgot my place for a while." She moved past him toward the door, her heart breaking with each step. Behind her, Cade's whisper was so faint she almost missed it. "Don't make me lose my second chance." Maria paused, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment she wanted to turn back, to tell him how much these months had meant to her, how she'd fallen in love not just with Evan, but with the gentle soul hiding behind his stern facade. Instead, she pretended not to hear and walked away, leaving only the ghost of her presence behind. The elevator doors closed on her tears, and the penthouse that had become home faded from view. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a text from Evan's night nurse. "He's asking for you, says he needs his angel." But angels, Maria thought, weren't meant to stay on Earth forever. Sometimes they had to fly away, even if it meant leaving their hearts behind. The night air was cold as she stepped onto the street, her suitcase rolling behind her, like the weight of dreams she'd never meant to have. A taxi waited at the curb, its yellow light a beacon in the darkness. As she climbed in, she caught one last glimpse of the penthouse windows high above, where a small figure, Evan, pressed his hand against the glass in farewell. "Where to?" the driver asked. Maria gave her mother's address in Queens, then turned away from the building that had housed so much joy and pain. She didn't see Cade watching from his office window, his hand matching his son's against the glass, both of them silently begging her to stay. Days stretched into weeks, each one longer than the last. The Donovan penthouse, once filled with warmth and laughter, had fallen back into its old shadows. Dust gathered on the piano keys where Maria used to sing hymns. The morning sun no longer brought the smell of fresh coffee and gentle humming from the kitchen. Cade threw himself into work with desperate intensity. 14-hour days became his norm, his office becoming a fortress against the emptiness at home. The cleaning staff whispered about how he'd aged years in mere weeks, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the return of whiskey bottles to his study. "Sir," Mrs. Porter ventured one morning, "perhaps we should call Miss Jenkins. Young Master Evan hasn't spoken a word since—" "That will be all." Cade cut her off, his voice sharp but brittle. Evan's silence was the heaviest burden. The boy who had finally found his voice now moved through the penthouse like a ghost, his drawings growing darker, filled with stormy skies and lone figures. His teachers called with concerns, reporting he'd stopped participating in class activities. The media circus around Lydia's pregnancy claim grew more frenzied each day. Photographers camped outside Donovan Enterprises, shouting questions about paternity tests and wedding plans. The board of directors called emergency meetings, worried about the company's plummeting stock prices. 3 major investors pulled out this morning. Harrison, the CFO, reported grimly. They're concerned about stability and leadership. The expansion project in Asia is dead. Cade finished, staring out his office window at the grey spring rain. Everything he touched seemed to wither lately. One night, unable to sleep, Cade wandered the quiet halls of his home. A soft sound drew him to Evan's room, muffled crying. He found his son curled up in bed, clutching Maria's old hymn book to his chest. The sight broke something in Cade's carefully constructed walls. "I miss her too, buddy," he whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. Evan looked up with tear-stained cheeks. "Why did Mama leave us?" The question, so simple, so devastating, brought Cade to his knees beside the bed. "Because," his voice cracked, "because I was too proud to fight for her. Too scared to admit I needed her." For the first time since Sarah's death, Cade felt the full weight of his loneliness crush him. Right there, on his son's bedroom floor, he did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. "God," he whispered through tears, his forehead pressed against the carpet. "I thought I wanted sons, more children to fill this empty house. But you sent me salvation through her. You sent me hope, and I was too blind to see it." Across town, in a small clinic in Queens, Maria moved through her days with mechanical precision. The work was good. helping mothers and children who couldn't afford better care. She should have felt fulfilled. The clinic director praised her gentle touch with frightened children, her ability to calm anxious mothers. But every lullaby she sang to soothe a crying baby reminded her of Evan's little voice calling her Mama. Every child's drawing pinned to the clinic walls made her think of his artistic soul. At night, she'd catch herself reaching for her phone to check if Mrs. Porter had sent an update about his bedtime routine. "You've got a gift with children," Dr. Chen, her supervisor, commented one afternoon as Mariah calmed a colicky infant. "But there's such sadness in your eyes when you hold them." Mariah tried to smile. "I'm content here," she said, but the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Spring arrived, painting the city in fresh colors, but neither Cade nor Mariah could appreciate its beauty. They moved through their separate lives like actors in different plays, each carrying the weight of what might have been. In the penthouse, Cade found himself standing at the piano each evening, running his fingers over the keys Mariah once cleaned so carefully. He'd catch himself listening for her footsteps, expecting to turn and find her there with her gentle smile and quiet strength. At the clinic, Mariah worked late into the evenings, avoiding her empty apartment where memories waited to ambush her. She'd open her Bible to find pressed flowers from the penthouse garden or catch the scent of Evan's favorite cookies on her clothes. One particularly difficult day, after treating a boy Evan's age who'd also lost his mother, Mariah retreated to the clinic's supply closet and allowed herself to cry. She pulled out her phone and looked at the last photo she had of them. Evan showing her his latest drawing, Cade watching them both with unguarded tenderness in his eyes. "I miss you," she whispered to the image. "I miss you both so much it hurts." Meanwhile, Cade sat in his study, holding the same hymn book Evan had been clutching. Its pages fell open to "It Is Well With My Soul," the hymn she'd been singing when Evan first spoke. The margin held a note in her neat handwriting. "Sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest challenges." He traced the words with his finger, remembering how she'd transformed their lives with her quiet faith and unwavering compassion. The penthouse felt colder without her presence, as if she'd taken all the warmth with her when she left. Even the house staff seemed to move more slowly, their usual chatter replaced by heavy sighs. Mrs. Porter would sometimes stand in the kitchen doorway, watching the space where Mariah used to prepare Evan's breakfast, shaking her head at the silence that had reclaimed their home. The days continued their relentless march forward, but for Cade and Mariah, time seemed stuck in that moment of separation. That elevator door closing, that whispered plea unacknowledged. Both convinced themselves they were doing what was best for the other, while their hearts knew better. They were two parts of a broken whole, separated by pride, fear, and circumstances, each believing they'd lost what was meant to save them. Spring bloomed outside their windows, but winter remained in their hearts, waiting for something or someone to thaw the frost of separation. The afternoon light filtered through the windows of Cade's office, casting long shadows across his desk. His fingers drummed against the polished wood as he reviewed quarterly reports, trying to focus on numbers that seemed meaningless compared to the emptiness in his heart. His phone buzzed. Dr. Lee's name flashed across the screen. "Mr. Donovan." The doctor's voice was careful, measured. "I need to discuss something important with you. It's about Ms. Marlowe's pregnancy claims." Cade's hand tightened on the phone. "Go on." "As her attending physician, I've been troubled by certain inconsistencies. After reviewing her medical records, I can state with absolute certainty that Ms. Marlowe is not pregnant. Moreover, given the timing she claimed, it would have been impossible for you to be the father." The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Cade felt a strange mixture of relief and anger wash over him. "She used your name, sir, for attention. The press coverage, the social media storm, It was all calculated. Cade stood up, looking out over the city. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for your honesty. I apologize for not coming forward sooner. Medical ethics required careful consideration. After ending the call, Cade's fury built like a gathering storm. He'd let Lydia's lies drive away the one person who'd brought light back into his life. Within minutes, his assistant had located Lydia at a charity luncheon downtown. The restaurant buzzed with Manhattan's elite when Cade strode in. Lydia sat at a central table, holding court in a designer dress, her laugh carrying across the room. She froze when she saw him. Cade! I didn't expect— It's over, Lydia. His voice cut through the ambient chatter. Dr. Lee confirmed everything. There is no baby. There never was. The room fell silent. Phones appeared, recording the confrontation. Lydia's face paled. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You saw the media attention around Mariah and decided to reclaim the spotlight. You used my grief, my guilt, my son's trauma, all for attention. Please, she whispered, not here. Why not here? You wanted an audience. Now you have one. He turned to address the watching crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your lunch. I just wanted to set the record straight. Ms. Marlowe is not carrying my child. She never was. She lied to all of us. Lydia's mascara ran as tears streaked down her face. I needed you to see me again. She sobbed. You forgot about me so easily. No, Lydia, I grew up. I found something real. He placed his napkin on the table. I hope you find peace somewhere. Walking out into the afternoon sun, Cade felt lighter than he had in months. His phone buzzed constantly with news alerts about the scene, but for the first time in his career, he didn't care about his reputation. Rain clouds gathered as he drove back to the office. He needed one thing, Mariah's address from the old payroll records. The HR department scrambled to help, and within an hour, he had it. A small apartment in Queens. Thunder rolled across the sky as Cade's driver navigated through increasingly heavy traffic. The windshield wipers fought against the downpour, while Cade's heart raced with each mile closer to her. Meanwhile, across the city, Mariah moved through the quiet halls of the small clinic. It was well past closing time, but a teenage girl had arrived in active labor, terrified and alone. Her parents had thrown her out when they discovered her pregnancy, and the baby's father was long gone. I'm scared, the girl whispered between contractions. Mariah held her hand. I know, sweetheart, but you're not alone anymore. Hours passed as Mariah coached her through the delivery. The girl's face was so young, so vulnerable, barely 16 years old. Yet here she was, bringing new life into the world. You're doing great, Jessica, Mariah encouraged. Just a little more. When the baby's first cry pierced the air, both women had tears in their eyes. Mariah cleaned the tiny girl, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and placed her in Jessica's arms. She's beautiful, Jessica breathed. Yes, she is. Mariah smiled, remembering another mother-child pair she'd loved. What will you name her? Grace, Jessica said softly, because that's what I need most right now. Mariah's heart squeezed as she watched them together. Here was another child who would grow up without a father, another mother facing a difficult road ahead. But there was also hope in this room, the same hope she'd seen bloom in Evan's eyes. As she held the newborn while Jessica rested, Mariah gazed down at the innocent face. Every life deserves grace, she whispered, rocking gently. Every single one. Thunder crashed outside the clinic windows. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally arrived in full force. Mariah didn't know that at that very moment, Grace was indeed coming for her, in the form of a black town car fighting through the deluge, carrying a man who had finally learned what mattered most. The rain beat against the clinic's windows as Mariah continued her gentle vigil, humming softly to the sleeping newborn. Outside, lightning illuminated the wet streets where Cade's car inched closer through the storm, each flash of light guiding him toward the woman who had taught him how to live again. The storm intensified as midnight approached. Inside the small clinic, Mariah gathered her belongings, her mind still on Jessica and baby Grace sleeping peacefully in the recovery room. The night nurse had arrived to take over, allowing Mariah to finally head home. She pulled on her worn raincoat, its familiar weight a comfort after the emotional evening. Through the clinic's foggy windows, streetlights created halos in the mist. Mariah's fingers trembled slightly as she collected her keys, exhaustion from the long shift settling into her bones. The day's events had left her physically drained but spiritually full. There was something profound about witnessing new life enter the world, about being present for those first precious moments. She thought of another child, Evan, and how his first words had changed everything. The memory made her heart ache. 3 months had passed since she'd left the Donovan penthouse, but time hadn't dulled the pain of separation. She missed Evan's shy smile, his tentative hugs, the way he would hide behind curtains just to watch her clean the piano. The old brass keys jingled as she locked the clinic's front door. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, and the late-night air carried the clean scent of wet pavement. Mariah pulled her coat tighter, preparing for the walk to the subway station. That's when she saw it. A black town car, elegant and out of place in this humble neighborhood, idling beneath a flickering streetlight. Her heart stopped. She knew that car. The back door opened, and Cade Donovan stepped out into the rain. His usually impeccable suit was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked nothing like the polished CEO who commanded boardrooms. Instead, he appeared vulnerable, almost desperate. "Mariah," he called softly, his voice barely carrying over the patter of raindrops. She stood frozen on the clinic steps, her keys still clutched in her hand. "Mr. Donovan, what are you—" "Please," he interrupted, taking a step closer. "Just Cade. I've been searching for you all night." The streetlight above them sputtered, casting shadows across his face. In the distance, thunder rolled through the clouds like a warning, or perhaps a blessing. "I saw the news," Mariah said quietly. "About Lydia." "It wasn't about her." Cade moved closer, rain dripping from his chin. "It was never about her. You need to know something. You didn't just heal my boy." His voice cracked with emotion. "You healed me." Mariah tried to speak, but tears welled up unexpectedly, choking her words. The truth of his statement hit her hard. She had watched him change over those months, had seen the ice around his heart slowly melt. What happened next took her breath away. Cade Donovan, billionaire CEO, dropped to his knees in the wet street. Mud soaked through his expensive trousers, but he didn't seem to notice or care. His eyes, usually so guarded, were open and raw with emotion. "If you'll still have me," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll spend every year proving I meant more than those cruel words I spoke the first night. I'll spend a lifetime showing you the man you helped me become." The rain continued its gentle descent, creating a private world around them. The flickering streetlight cast an almost ethereal glow, making the moment feel suspended in time. Thunder rumbled again, closer now, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Mariah's hand moved of its own accord, reaching out to touch his cheek. His skin was cold from the rain, but she felt the warmth beneath. This was the real Cade, not the bitter man who had lashed out months ago, not the grieving widower lost in whiskey and regret, but the father who had learned to love again. "I never wanted to birth you sons, Cade," she said softly, her thumb brushing away a raindrop, or perhaps a tear, from his cheek. "I wanted to help you be a father again, the father Evan deserves, the man I knew you could be." He rose then, pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. They clung to each other as the rain washed over them, cleansing away months of hurt and misunderstanding. His arms felt like home, not the false security of wealth or status, but the true safety of being known and accepted. The shame that had haunted them both, his cruel words that first night, her fear of causing scandal, their mutual struggle with unexpected feelings, seemed to dissolve in the cleansing rain. In its place grew something stronger: forgiveness, understanding, and the possibility of love built on healing rather than hurt. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, as the storm began to fade. The flickering streetlight steadied, casting a warm glow over them like a spotlight on a stage where a new story was beginning. In the distance, the lights of the clinic, where new life had just entered the world, continued to shine, a beacon of hope in the night. The rain softened to a misty caress, blessing them with its gentle touch. Neither spoke for a long moment, both understanding that sometimes the deepest truths need no words. They had found each other again, not in the glittering heights of a penthouse, but here on a humble street where healing happened every day. In the simple act of holding each other, they acknowledged all that had passed between them, the pain, the growth, the unexpected journey that had led them here. The night enveloped them in its tender embrace, witnessing the moment when two hearts, once broken, found their way to wholeness together. 3 days after their rainy reunion, sunshine filtered through the clinic's windows, casting warm patches on the worn linoleum floor. Mariah moved between the beds, checking on her young patients, humming softly as she worked. The children's ward had become her sanctuary these past months, a place where broken things could heal, where hope grew like flowers through concrete. She was adjusting 7-year-old Tommy's blanket when excited whispers rippled through the ward. Look who's here!" Mariah turned, and her heart skipped. There in the doorway stood Cade Donovan, looking different than she'd ever seen him. Gone was the stern businessman in his tailored suit. Instead, he wore casual clothes, a soft blue sweater and dark jeans. But it was the small figure beside him that made her breath catch. "Mariah!" Evan's voice rang out clear and strong, no trace of the silence that had gripped him for so long. He broke free from his father's hand and ran toward her, his little feet pattering against the floor. She knelt just in time to catch him in her arms. His familiar weight crashed into her, and she held him close, breathing in the scent of his hair. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I missed you so much." Evan's words tumbled out, fast and eager. "Daddy said we had to wait a few days to come see you, but I wanted to come right away, and look, I drew you pictures." He pulled back, fumbling with a folder clutched in his hands. The other children in the ward watched with wide eyes and curious smiles. Some sat up in their beds for a better view, while others whispered excitedly to their mothers. They'd all heard Mariah speak of the little boy who'd found his voice again. Cade stood in the doorway, watching the reunion with eyes that held both joy and something deeper, a certainty, a peace that hadn't been there before. He stepped forward slowly, and the sunlight caught his face, highlighting the smile that had replaced his usual stern expression. "These are beautiful, Evan," Mariah said, looking through the drawings. Each page showed moments from their time together. Breakfast at the mansion, reading stories, decorating the Christmas tree. The last drawing made her pause. It showed 3 figures holding hands, with the words, "My family," written in careful child's letters. She looked up to find Cade standing before her. The air seemed to still, filled with possibility. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that caught the light. a delicate gold chain with a cross pendant. "This belonged to Claire," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed room. "She wore it every day of our marriage. When she died, I locked it away with my grief. But yesterday I opened that box for the first time in years, and I knew this belongs to the woman who taught me to believe again." Mariah's heart thundered in her chest as Cade slowly knelt before her, there in the children's ward where she'd found her own healing. The cross dangled from his fingers, catching sparks of sunlight. "You didn't just save my son," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me. You showed me that faith isn't about perfect people, it's about broken ones finding grace. I'm not offering you wealth or status. I'm offering you my heart, my son, and every day I have left to prove worthy of your love." A collective gasp went through the room. The children who could walk had crept closer, forming a small circle around them. Their mothers watched from beds and chairs, some wiping away tears of their own. Mariah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this moment. This wasn't how she'd imagined a proposal, not in her modest clinic, surrounded by the simple work she loved. Yet somehow, it was perfect. This was where her heart lived, where healing happened every day. But she hesitated, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of grace being offered. Could this be real? Could love really transform so much? Evan stepped forward then, taking the necklace from his father's hands. His small fingers worked the clasp carefully as he moved behind her. "Please, Mama," he asked, his voice soft and hopeful. "Please stay with us forever." The word Mama broke something open in her heart. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she felt the cool metal settle against her skin. The cross rested just above her heart. A perfect weight, a perfect reminder of the journey that had brought them here. She looked at Cade, still kneeling before her, then at Evan's hopeful face, and finally at the children and mothers around them. Her other family, the ones who had given her purpose when she felt lost. They were all part of this story, this miracle of healing. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." The ward erupted in cheers. The children who could clapped and shouted. Mothers wiped away tears, perhaps remembering their own love stories or dreaming of new ones. Even little Tommy, still weak from surgery, managed a bright smile from his bed. Cade rose and swept her into his arms, lifting her feet off the ground as he held her close. She wrapped her arms around his neck, laughing through her tears. Evan hugged their legs, creating a perfect circle of joy. Through the windows, the sun broke fully through the clouds, flooding the ward with golden light. It touched everything: the metal bed frames, the children's faces, the simple cross now resting against Mariah's heart. In that moment, the clinic felt less like a place of sickness and more like a cathedral, sacred with the presence of love and healing. They stood there, the three of them, surrounded by witnesses to their joy. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A story of how love could find you in unexpected places, how grace could transform darkness into light, and how sometimes the greatest miracles start with a simple act of kindness. The sunlight continued to pour in, blessing them all with its warmth, while outside the city moved on, unaware that in this modest clinic, love had just performed another miracle of healing. Spring arrived in New York City like a gentle whisper, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The clinic's garden, once a humble patch of green, had transformed into a sanctuary of hope. Cherry blossoms dotted the morning air with pink petals, while wild roses climbed the weathered brick walls, nature's own decoration for this sacred day. The garden filled slowly with an eclectic gathering of souls. Former housekeepers from the Donovan mansion stood shoulder to shoulder with children from the clinic, their Sunday best a rainbow of borrowed dresses and carefully pressed suits. Church members from Pastor Glenn's congregation mingled with mothers Mariah had helped, each carrying their own story of how her kindness had touched their lives. At the center of it all stood a simple wooden arch, draped with wildflowers gathered by the children themselves. White daisies, purple cone flowers, and yellow black-eyed Susans created a natural cathedral, swaying gently in the spring breeze. Beneath it waited Cade Donovan, a changed man in a simple grey suit that spoke more of humility than wealth. His hands fidgeted slightly with his tie, not from doubt, but from the weight of grace this moment carried. Gone was the hard shell of the billionaire CEO, replaced by a man who had learned to kneel in prayer. His eyes kept drifting to the clinic's back door, anticipating the moment that would change everything. Pastor Glenn stood beside him, his weathered Bible open in his hands. "Remember," he whispered to Cade, "this is God's poetry. Beauty from ashes." The small string quartet, made up of local music students, began playing Amazing Grace. The garden hushed. Every head turned as the clinic's door opened, revealing a sight that brought tears to many eyes. There stood Mariah in a modest ivory gown that seemed to glow with inner light. The dress was simple, no beading or elaborate train, but on her it looked like something from heaven. Around her neck gleamed Clare's cross, catching the morning sun. But it was her smile that transformed her, radiating a joy that made her beautiful beyond measure. Beside her, holding her hand with solemn pride, stood Evan. He wore a miniature version of his father's suit, his small shoulders straight with the importance of his role. As they began their walk down the petal-strewn path, he looked up at Mariah with pure adoration. The congregation rose, but this was no formal ceremony with rigid traditions. Children waved from their seats, calling out quiet, "Hi, Mama," as Mariah passed. She smiled at each one, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. When they reached the arch, Evan placed Mariah's hand in his father's, then wrapped his arms around them both. The gesture wasn't planned, but it captured perfectly what this union meant. Not just two hearts joining, but a family being made whole. Pastor Glenn's voice carried across the garden, rich with emotion. "We gather today to witness a miracle of second chances," he began. "In a world that often speaks of endings, we stand in a garden of new beginnings. We've watched love rise from ruin, faith bloom from doubt, and grace heal what seemed beyond repair." He spoke of how Mariah had entered the Donovan household as a servant, but became its heart. How her quiet faith had taught a broken man to pray again. How her gentle spirit had given voice to a silent child. The story of their love, he said, was proof that God still wrote romance in the margins of ordinary days. When it came time for the vows, Cade's voice trembled slightly as he began. "Mariah," he said, "I once offered you wealth, thinking that was power. You showed me true riches in a child's smile, in morning prayers, in simple acts of kindness. I promise to honor your faith, to walk beside you in service, and to never forget that my greatest fortune is your love." Mariah's vows came straight from her heart. "Cade," she said clearly, though tears shone in her eyes, "I promise to never stop praying for you, to love Evan as my own, and to remind you every day that grace is stronger than grief. You didn't just give me a family. You showed me that love can build bridges between any two hearts that trust in God's timing." As Pastor Glenn pronounced them husband and wife, the church bells from nearby St. Michael's began to ring, their joyful pealing filling the spring air. Cade drew Mariah close, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of both passion and reverence. At that moment, the children released 24 white doves into the sky. The birds circled once above the garden before soaring toward the heavens, symbols of hope taking flight. Everyone watched them go, these living prayers ascending into the perfect blue of a spring morning. Somewhere in the city, printing presses were already rolling with tomorrow's papers. The headlines would read, "Billionaire marries the woman who saved his soul." But here in this garden, surrounded by those who had witnessed their journey, titles and wealth meant nothing. This was simply a story of love, proof that even the hardest hearts could learn to beat again when touched by grace. The morning sun blessed them all, turning the garden into holy ground where miracles bloomed like spring flowers and second chances took root in fertile soil. The late summer breeze carried the sound of children's laughter through the renovated Donovan estate grounds. Where cold marble and stern architecture once dominated, warmth now flourished. The mansion's east wing had been transformed into the Hope Haven Center for mothers and children, its halls filled with the very life that had been missing for so many years. Mariah stood at the window of her office, watching as another young mother learned to read while her toddler played safely nearby. The sight never failed to fill her heart with gratitude. 6 months into marriage had brought more blessings than she could count, each day revealing new ways that God could turn pain into purpose. She glanced at the clock, 4:30 in the afternoon. Right on schedule, she heard the familiar sound of bicycle wheels scraping concrete, followed by Evan's determined voice. "I can do it, Dad." Outside, Cade jogged alongside their son, one hand hovering protectively near the bicycle seat. Evan's tongue stuck out slightly in concentration as he pedaled, training wheels recently removed. His helmet was decorated with superhero stickers, a small rebellion against the formal attire he'd once been required to wear. "That's it, buddy," Cade encouraged, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. "Keep your eyes forward, just like we practiced." Mariah slipped out to the driveway, her heart swelling at the sight. Gone was the broken man who'd once drowned his sorrows in whiskey. In his place stood a father who'd learned to laugh again, to play again, to love without fear. Evan spotted her and waved excitedly. "Mama, look! I'm doing it!" The distraction wobbled his balance, but Cade steadied him quickly. "Eyes forward, champion," Cade reminded gently. "Show Mama how steady you can be." The sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Garden lights started twinkling on automatically, Cade's anniversary gift to Mariah, transforming their backyard into an enchanted evening paradise. The soft white bulbs draped through the trees and along the pergola created a ceiling of stars. As twilight deepened, more families emerged from the center, heading home with hope in their eyes and resources in their hands. Each one stopped to thank Mariah, some hugging her, others simply nodding with tear-filled smiles. She knew their stories now, the single mother fleeing abuse, the widow struggling to feed her children, the teenage mom determined to finish school. Each one precious, each one worthy of love. "Last ride for today," Cade called to Evan, who had mastered a wobbly but independent circle of the driveway. "Time to clean up for dinner." While Evan carefully parked his bike, Cade walked over to Mariah. His eyes held that look she'd come to treasure, part wonder, part devotion, as if he still couldn't quite believe this was his life. "Dance with me?" he asked softly, extending his hand. Mariah smiled, slipping off her shoes. The grass felt cool beneath her feet as Cade led her to their garden sanctuary. No music played except the evening's natural symphony, crickets, distant wind chimes, the rustle of leaves, but they didn't need any other melody. Cade pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers against his heart. They swayed gently, bare feet moving in perfect sync. His cologne mixed with the scent of summer flowers, creating a fragrance that meant home to her now. "Remember our first dance?" he murmured near her ear. "At the wedding?" "How could I forget? Evan insisted on joining us halfway through." They both laughed at the memory. Their wedding had been perfectly imperfect, full of unrehearsed moments that spoke more truly of family than any planned pageantry could have. From the porch, soft candlelight illuminated their favorite scripture verse, framed in simple wood. He makes all things new. Revelation 21:5. The words had become their family motto, a testimony to God's faithfulness in their journey from broken to blessed. "Mommy, Daddy!" Evan's voice rang out across the garden. "Wait for me." He ran toward them, paper clutched in his hand, dark hair tousled from his helmet. Without missing a beat, Cade scooped him up with one arm, keeping Mariah close with the other. They continued their dance as a trio, Evan giggling as they turned. "I made something," he announced proudly, holding up his latest masterpiece. The drawing showed 3 figures standing under a shining cross. Mommy with her curly hair, Daddy tall and strong, and Evan in the middle, holding both their hands. Hearts floated around them, and at the top, in careful 7-year-old printing, he'd written, "My family." "This," Cade said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what forever looks like." Mariah touched the cross at her throat, Claire's cross, now a symbol not of loss, but of legacy. How beautifully God had woven their stories together, bringing healing to them all. They stayed in the garden until stars appeared above the twinkle lights, dancing slowly, holding each other close. Evan eventually dozed against Cade's shoulder, his drawing still clutched tight. The night air filled with a peace that went beyond understanding. The quiet joy of promises fulfilled, of love reborn from brokenness, of faith rekindled from ashes. The Hope Haven Center stood as testament to their journey, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Inside, new stories of redemption were already being written. Outside, under heaven's canopy, the Donovans celebrated their own miracle, a family made whole by grace, a love stronger than any wealth could buy, and a future bright with possibilities they'd once thought lost forever. When Mariah finally looked up at her husband, she saw tears shining in his eyes. No words were needed. They both knew this was more than happiness. This was holy ground. And as night settled fully over their sanctuary, the twinkle lights seemed to whisper what they'd learned, that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as ordinary moments, that love can heal the deepest wounds, and that God specializes in writing the most beautiful stories from the most broken beginnings. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.